Michael Douglas remembered the first time he realized his father wasn't just a man. He was Kirk Douglas. It happened in a movie theater when Michael was 7 years old, watching his father on a screen 30 feet tall, larger than life, commanding every eye in the room. The audience erupted in applause, but Michael just sat there, confused. That wasn't his dad. His dad was the man who barely made it home for dinner, the man whose intensity filled their house like electricity, the man who never seemed satisfied, no matter what anyone did. Growing up as Kirk Douglas's son meant living with a ghost, a version of his father that belonged to the world, while Michael fought for scraps of attention from the real man. The tabloids would later claim they were estranged, that there was no love between them. But the truth was something the public could never understand. Their relationship wasn't broken. It was just built on a language neither of them knew how to speak. If you want to discover more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe to our channel. Now, let's continue with this remarkable journey. Michael grew up in a world of contradictions. The public saw Kirk Douglas as the ultimate Hollywood icon. The dimpled chin, the intense blue eyes, the roles that defined masculinity for an entire generation. Champion, Spartacus, Lust for Life. These weren't just films, they were cultural monuments. But those who actually lived in that house understood something more nuanced. Kirk Douglas was present, perhaps too present, his expectations hanging in the air like smoke, impossible to escape but difficult to grasp. When Michael decided to pursue acting, the decision wasn't met with celebration. It was met with a challenge. Kirk didn't discourage his son, but he didn't make it easy either. He had spent decades building the Douglas name into something that meant quality, intensity, commitment. The tabloids interpreted this as competition, as a father threatened by his son's ambition. They created narratives about Kirk actively sabotaging Michael's career, about refusing to help him land roles, about deliberately keeping him in the shadows. The truth was more complicated and ultimately more revealing about both men. By the time Michael landed a recurring role on the streets of San Francisco in 1972, he had already decided something crucial. He would never just be an actor like his father. He would become something Kirk had never been, a producer, a creator, someone who controlled the narrative rather than just performing it. The year 1975 marked a seismic shift in the Douglas family dynamic. Michael Douglas, working as a producer on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, accomplished something that even his legendary father had failed to achieve. He won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The story behind that Oscar is revealing about both father and son. Kirk Douglas had originated the role of Randall McMurphy on Broadway in 1963, pouring his soul into a character that seemed written for his particular intensity. He fought for years to get the film made, but by the time Hollywood was ready, Kirk was considered too old for the part. The role went to Jack Nicholson instead. Michael, who had acquired the rights to the property, made a decision that many saw as a betrayal. He cast Nicholson, not his father. The tabloids had a field day with this. They painted Michael as an ungrateful son, deliberately snubbing Kirk in favor of another actor. They wrote about family rifts, about Kirk's devastation, about a relationship destroyed by ambition and competition. But those close to the situation understood something the magazines never bothered to investigate. Kirk himself had told Michael to cast Nicholson. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the film needed a younger actor, that his time for that role had passed. What looked like rejection was actually Kirk's final lesson to his son. Sometimes love means letting go, even when it costs you everything you wanted. The 1980s brought both Douglas men to the peak of their powers, though in different ways. Kirk, now in his 60s, was transitioning from leading man to elder statesman of Hollywood. Michael, riding the success of Romancing the Stone and preparing to become Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, was ascending to the exact kind of stardom his father had once owned. The tabloids salivated over this dynamic, creating narratives about an aging king watching his son take the throne, about rivalry and resentment and family warfare. They pointed to the fact that Kirk and Michael rarely appeared together publicly, that they gave interviews where they spoke about each other in measured, careful terms. February 1996 brought a phone call that Michael Douglas had been dreading his entire life. Kirk Douglas, at 79 years old, had suffered a severe stroke. The man who had defined masculine strength for half a century, who had never shown weakness, who had built an entire persona around invulnerability, was suddenly helpless. The stroke affected Kirk's speech center, leaving him unable to form words, unable to communicate in the way that had always defined him. For a man whose entire career was built on commanding language, on delivering dialogue with intensity and precision, this was a devastation beyond physical. Michael flew to be with his father immediately, and what he found shattered every assumption he had carried about their relationship. Kirk Douglas, stripped of his ability to speak, was forced to communicate in different ways, through expressions, through tears, through a vulnerability that he had spent 8 decades avoiding. And Michael, who had spent his life trying to decode his father's stern expectations, suddenly understood something profound. All those years of toughness, of impossible standards, of love expressed through discipline rather than words, it had all been because Kirk Douglas didn't know any other way. The stroke didn't create a new relationship between father and son. It revealed the relationship that had always existed underneath the Hollywood armor. The rehabilitation process took years. Kirk had to learn to speak again, forming words like a child, frustrated by the disconnect between his sharp mind and his uncooperative mouth. Michael visited regularly, and for the first time in their relationship, he was the strong one, the guide, the teacher. He sat with his father through speech therapy sessions, encouraged him through the humiliating process of relearning basic communication, stayed patient when Kirk's frustration exploded into tears or anger. The tabloids, always hungry for drama, largely ignored this period. There was no scandal here, no headline-worthy conflict, just a son caring for his father, a dynamic they had never bothered to explore because it didn't fit their narrative of estrangement. What emerged from Kirk's stroke was unexpected conversation. Real conversation, not the performance of conversation they had always engaged in. Kirk, unable to hide behind his famous intensity, behind the Kirk Douglas persona he had constructed, became simply a father talking to his son. He spoke about his own childhood, about the poverty and shame that had driven him, about the fears that success never quite erased. He talked about Michael's grandfather, Herschel, and how the cycle of tough love had been passed down through generations of Douglas men, each one believing they were preparing their sons for a brutal world. And Michael, listening to his father's struggle through these revelations, understood that he had been loved all along, just not in the way movies had taught him to expect. Kirk Douglas lived to be 103 years old, dying peacefully in February 2020. In the decades between his stroke and his death, something remarkable happened to his relationship with Michael. It became uncomplicated. The competition was gone, the impossible standards had softened, the need to constantly prove themselves to each other had faded. They became, simply, a father and son who had survived Hollywood together and come out the other side with a relationship built on hard-earned understanding. The tabloids never corrected their narrative. Years of articles about estrangement, about coldness, about a relationship defined by absence and resentment. None of it was ever walked back. Even when Michael Douglas gave interviews about his father in later years, speaking with obvious affection and respect, the media continued to filter it through their preferred story. They pointed to Michael's honesty about his father's toughness and saw confirmation of their theories, never recognizing that honesty itself was a sign of intimacy, of a relationship secure enough to acknowledge complexity. The truth was simpler and more profound than any scandal. Kirk Douglas raised his son the way he had been raised, believing that love meant preparation for a world that would show no mercy. He pushed Michael because he believed in him, demanded excellence because he knew his son was capable of it, refused to make things easy because easy success had destroyed too many young men with famous names. Was it perfect parenting? No. Did it cause pain? Absolutely. But it was never abandonment, never indifference, Never the cold rejection that tabloids love to sell to readers hungry for Hollywood dysfunction. Michael Douglas understood this, even when it was hardest, even when he resented his father's intensity, even when he wished for something softer. He understood because he eventually became a father himself and felt the terror of trying to raise a child in the spotlight without crushing them under expectations. He found himself repeating some of his father's patterns, catching echoes of Kirk's voice in his own words to his children, realizing that the cycle of generational toughness was harder to break than he had imagined. In Kirk Douglas's final years, he and Michael developed a ritual. Michael would visit his father's home in Beverly Hills, and they would sit together in the garden, the same garden where young Michael had once played while his father was away on location. They didn't always talk much. Kirk's speech never fully recovered, and some words remained forever out of reach. But they had learned a different kind of communication, one that didn't require the performance of emotion or the declaration of feelings. Kirk Douglas died at 103, having outlived most of his generation. His death made headlines around the world. Spartacus was gone. The last titan of old Hollywood had fallen. Michael Douglas's statement was brief and dignified, speaking of his father's legacy, his strength, his impact on cinema. The tabloids analyzed every word for hidden meaning, for signs of unresolved issues, for any hint of the dysfunction they had spent decades insisting existed. But those who actually understood the Douglas family saw something else in Michael's words: peace. Not the peace of resolution after conflict, but the peace of a man who had always known he was loved, even when that love came wrapped in challenge and demand and impossible expectation. The shadow that Michael had grown up in wasn't actually his father's shadow. It was the shadow of who the world thought Kirk Douglas was, the persona, the image, the construct of masculinity and stardom that Hollywood had built around one man's intensity. The real Kirk Douglas was more complex, more vulnerable, more human than any role he ever played. The tabloids sold a story of estrangement because dysfunction makes better headlines than complexity. But the truth about Kirk and Michael Douglas was never as simple as absent father and resentful son. It was the story of two men trying to love each other across a gap created by generation, by Hollywood, by different understandings of what it meant to be strong. It was messy and imperfect and sometimes painful, but it was real. And in the end, that mattered more than any headline ever could.